The all-in interview with Ron Johnson covered a lot of topics. Here they are, some of the footnotes we could cover. Which one do you want to start with?
Carried interest, Econ war story, incentives, DOGE. What about the Econ war story? Seems pretty topical here. That's a little scarier than World War II, considering we're not in a world war.
Okay, good choice. I really didn't think you would choose that, and I had a whole bit where I would be like, "Oh, sorry, Joe, you chose the wrong one because I didn't prepare." That's the one you chose.
Is that the one you did?
I know. I intentionally told you not to look at the notes.
For
for this explicit bit.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I guess that's a good thing. I guess. Let's start with the clip.
Entered World War II spending about 11.7%, ramped it up to 41% during the war. By 1948, they were down to 11.4%. So it's entirely possible, but you need leadership.
So he was talking about, he just wanted to give an example that World War II, we were able to ramp up spending and then we ramped it back down. That's really his main point. And they spoke about it a little bit in the comments, and just the context that I wanted to understand was like, so what happened exactly? How did that happen? Reading the comments, you'd say, okay, this guy kind of points out, so how did the death spiral? Because the whole thing was this, deadly death spiral. Deadly debt spiral. That's hard to say. And this guy's pointing out was, how come we didn't fall into a deadly debt spiral at the end of World War II, right? I thought that it was supposed to be self-reinforcing, and we weren't even very careful with our money. We did the exact opposite. And then we got a couple of response, somewhat correct. The government exponentially raised taxes.
Exponentially.
Some other guys, we can't raise taxes enough to cover the deficit spending. Someone else said, he believes that everyone, including himself, need to pay more taxes. And this just kind of got me thinking. It's like, I don't really have a good understanding of the economic history around World War II. And I'm going to believe Ron Johnson's comment saying that, we went in very little spending, had a huge amount of spending, and then it came down. How did that happen?
Do you,
how did it happen,
have the
Joe?
figures that he mentioned? Because I think that's pretty important.
Oh, well, what do you say? Look at that. Next graphic, Joe. We are on the same wavelength today. This is going to be great. Yeah, so I just wanted to put, in graph form what he was mentioning, what we're going to talk about. So this is as a percent of GDP, and these were the numbers that he cited. He said, all right, 11.7%. These are outlays. So this is government expenditure as a percent of GDP. Ramped it up to, I think he said 41%. Just kind of on a little side note, data from this era is not nearly as easy to get as from like 1960 or something, or like Fred data since then.
Naturally.
You kind of got to piece it together from a couple different sources. So the fact that we're not getting the exact same numbers is not super surprising to me. So just keep that in mind. So that's what he's talking about. And again, let's just look at kind of the debt, the shape of the receipts. It really just ramped up, and then it kind of remained sort of in that bar. But we'll get into that in a bit. So this is the debt to GDP, and we're working with the right axis over here. We're going to introduce a couple other lines in a second, but this is the shape of it. This is debt to GDP. So right now, they're already over 100% in the middle of the war era. That's, a big deal. And, before that, it was hovering, call it around sort of this area, 40-ish%, went up, and then we kind of slowly brought it back down. All right. So, this is the debt divided by GDP. That's the ratio. So let's look at the individual components of that ratio, the numerator and the denominator. This is what it looks like. So we have debt. That's the green line. That's in the numerator. And then we have the nominal GDP, and that's in the denominator. So you can see here the area in which the debt exceeded GDP. That's when you're getting over 100%, because it's literally just green line divided by blue line. Now this tells you a couple other things. The outstanding debt was pretty flat, and the way in which we lowered the pink bar was really by growing GDP. To be more precise, nominal GDP. Yeah. So that's kind of, we can zoom in another layer, but this is kind of at the broadest terms. This is what we're talking about. So the next thing I want to show you though, is we've got the GDP growth nominal, and then we also have the inflation rate. So one of the things people talk about, if you want to get out of debt, one of the way you could do it is with inflation. You don't need real growth. You just need nominal GDP growth. That can also get you out of debt. And one of the bits of the story that goes around what happened, during and a little bit after World War II in terms of how we got out of the, very large debt to GDP numbers, I think a lot of it has to do with growth and inflation. You can see these, annual inflation rate numbers these are big numbers. Again, the data is a little bit messier back here. We're looking at shortly after the war, very high inflation numbers, which is going to grow nominal GDP. But if you look at this, you'll see that inflation rate's actually above nominal growth. So in real terms, you're actually looking at a contraction. Real GDP is, nominal minus inflation, which suggests that the real GDP growth after the war was actually negative, but we were still able to grow out of the debt. Anyway, I wanted to highlight that. I think that's part of the story. So now we're just talking about, GDP and debt outstanding, but a big part of the comments below had to do around taxes. So I want to talk to you a little bit, if you don't mind, a little historical lesson about taxes. And when I was looking into it, there's actually a pretty cool chart just up by Fidelity that I'm going to piggyback on. So in 1984, Congress actually tried to institute a federal income tax, a 2% flat tax, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. So instead, tariffs and excise taxes were put in place. Now, sure enough, Congress can make the laws, for goodness sakes. And the 16th Amendment to the Constitution authorized the federal income tax. And it was passed by Congress in 1909 and then ratified in 1913. So Congress waited 0 years and they issued an income tax. So in 1913, we got our kind of first income tax at the federal level. Pretty paltry, pretty low, not too bad.
Yeah.
So the average rate paid, according to this, was between 1 and 7.1%. Now, the average effective tax rate in 1945, that was up to 14.2%, compared with 14.9% in 2021. That's sort of an interesting little tidbit. So just the average tax, despite all the hemming and hawing and all that over the years, at the end of the day, the, average effective tax rate hasn't moved a whole lot since after the war.
Wait, sorry. So scroll up again. A little more. Okay, yeah. So like it's saying 1% on first 20,000, 7% on last 50,000. What is the 7% in 1913 mean? Is that is it just showing the top bracket?
Oh, so that's just the top bracket. Yeah. So
Okay.
I actually struggle with this. Yeah, I guess since 1913, you can get all of the tax brackets and you can show exactly what the tax rate was at each bracket, but it's very difficult to put that into a graph. I thought about it for a little bit. How would you display that? This is what Fidelity came up with. But yeah, the final number is just the largest tax bracket. But obviously that doesn't really give you a good sense of like how much that's going to be drawing in. Just because it's a super high rate in the highest bracket doesn't necessarily mean it's going to bring in more money. And I think we'll see that. It's like somewhat and loosely indicative. So I was looking around here. So we also noticed that it gives a little bit of a hint, this graphic, in terms of what was going on to see that sharp increase in the revenue as a percent of GDP that happened in 1942-43. But it doesn't really help you with that. It hints at it when it says in 1939 about 5% of American workers paid income tax, and then in 1945 it was 60%. But I wanted to get, let's put this into a slightly different form. So I think this graph is really what tells the story around what happened with World War II and how kind of the Econ story and how we were able to pay everything back. So let me just walk you through what we're looking at. I didn't label it particularly well, but this blue line is receipts as a percentage of GDP. I also put in some of the biggest tax reform bills that have been through Congress, since 1930. And the other little rub here is whenever there's an arrow pointing up, it indicates that act typically, broadened or raised taxes. So like the Revenue Act of 1942, Tax Reform Act of 69, TEFRA of 1982, all are, broadly agreed that this had raised taxes. Now, on the other half of this, the Kennedy tax cuts, the Tax Reform Act, and the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, broadly agreed had lowered taxes. Okay. Now, what I'm going to ask you is, if just looking at this, do you feel as though, that the change in the tax policy really moved the needle in terms of receipts?
So obviously in the extreme scenario, it does if you move it far enough. But I think what you're getting at is incremental changes introduced by bills through Congress. They don't have much impact. We were in a structurally different environment pre-1945 or so, and it stayed there ever since.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue, though, that the Revenue Act of 1942 definitely did move the bar.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of discounted that one. For one thing, I am not familiar with it at all, but in my mind, I was like, okay, that's war spending. It's a necessity. It's not a let's get a bill passed, let's debate it. It's like, no, we are in a huge emergency. It's happening now.
Right. So let's talk about the Revenue Act of 1942. It did two major things. The first half, it increased, number one, is that it increased the tax base. So, and it lowered tax exemptions. So before, the lower and middle income earners were not paying federal income tax. So only the rich people were paying income tax. But now, with the passage of the Revenue Act of 1942, finally, Joe, poor people were now paying their fair share. Okay? Finally. I mean, you see how ridiculous that sounds? But literally the number of people paying federal income tax increased by like 5x. Okay. So it's broadening the tax base. Okay. I mean, that's huge. That's going to move the needle.
Right. Yep. Which just goes to show you the whole rich pay their fair share thing is pretty silly.
So I'll get to that, because there's a little thing down here. You'll see Lucas shook, because I would have wholeheartedly agreed with you. But I did some looking into this, and now I'm a little, I don't know. I'm a little shook. The other thing that the Revenue Act of 1942 did, that I think is like super important, maybe other people would disagree, is that it introduced the payroll withholding concept. So employers now are required to withhold the income taxes directly from employees from their paychecks starting in 1943. This was introduced by Beardsley Ruml, RUML. And in my personal opinion, I think it is one of the most consequential decisions or ideas ever introduced into fiscal policy. And the reason why I think that, and I maintain that to this day, is just the psychological impact of having to give money back that you've already received, as opposed to never having it to begin with. So like, I think that if you had forced people to write a check at the end of every year for like 20% or whatever of their income, I don't think people could stomach it. I mean, when you're just signing out like tens of thousands of dollars, yeah, people won't do it to just sign away.
Like people just wouldn't have the ability to.
Yeah, they'd probably just spend it. I mean, they wouldn't have the discipline to just put that money aside or try to calculate it. So sure, there's like the calculation part. I personally think it's the psychological part. Having, my wife has got her own business. She's a tax accountant. And we have to put money aside throughout the year. And then it's just like, you've got to sign a huge check, and it's just like a huge punch in the gut. And to think about having kind of people do that every year, or like if you had to do it every month or something, I don't think it would be tolerated. But if you never see it, it never enters into your bank account to begin with. Right. And you get that W-2 form, you've seen that you had, tens of thousands of dollars in tax. It doesn't feel like anything. So anyway, both brilliant and, brilliantly, good idea, Beardsley.
Well, devious.
Anyway, the next point I'm going to make, I just want to preface by saying I'm a little pissed when I listened to the All In podcast since then. So we're recording this on Thursday. I think I listened to last Friday's episode on like my drive to work on Monday. And David Sachs made this point, that little punk, made the exact same point I'm about to make, which is, the thing that really moves it. Let me layer over one thing for you. So these big gray bars, those are recessions. And like, if you just kind of eyeball it, it definitely looks like, around these gray bars or shortly after them, the revenue, the receipts from the government kind of go down. Like, I would say there's more of a linkage between, those gray bars and then a decline in government receipts as a percent of GDP than there is to the, changes in the tax code. Now, that was like the exact point that Sachs made. Looking at the full graphic here, there's nothing else I'm going to introduce here, but like, you'll see that the Tax Reform Act of 69, it's up, this arrow, it's sort of below this line. It pushed taxes broadly up, but then receipts dropped. This one pushed taxes up, receipts dropped. This one pushed taxes down, didn't really go anywhere. Pushed taxes
it went
down.
Kind
of went down.
It's a really small amount.
Sure. Okay. But you kind of get what I'm saying, I think. Make your own decisions. This is what it looks like. I was kind of looking at this, and I think, David Sachs sort of starts to flirt with this idea. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I don't think you would be completely wrong if you didn't draw like the conclusion. And David Friedberg also has kind of made this point, whereby like, it looks like the amount of money that you can extract from people as a percent of GDP is like around, call it 20%. And I think David Friedberg even said as much.
One of the challenges is that there are, and we should reference these in the show notes, Nick, but there are well-researched economic studies that show that when a government tries to increase the taxation level north of 20% of GDP of that economy, that you actually see GDP growth go negative. That there's a certain natural equilibrium on which you can tax the system. Beyond that level, investment dollars go down and growth begins to shrink. And that's what triggers the spiraling problem, because then the government spending needs to go up to continue to grow and support growth in the economy. And it creates this inevitable spiraling.
And Sachs, again, was kind of flirting with that idea. And I was thinking about this and I was like, well, is that true? Because, we have other countries we can compare this to. So what do you think, Joe? Do you want to push it?
Off the cuff, I would think that, most European countries would be materially higher.
Yeah? What do you think?
I don't know, 30s, maybe 40s.
Oh, it's insane. I never really appreciated this. And I got a little shaken. Tax to GDP ratio compared to the OECD 2023. And I looked up Norway. That was like the first one I looked up, and Denmark. 41%. Joe.
Yeah, that's honestly like not surprising to me.
Look, the USA is down here. Look at that. Holding it up at 25%. And we were just looking at numbers that were like less than 20. So maybe there's something going on with the math or whatever.
What do you mean?
Well, look, 2023, if I look at my numbers, tax to GDP ratio, the 2020, that's not on here, but it's nowhere near 2020. It's nowhere near 25%.
I see the point that you're touching on here. To me, it makes sense that these European countries are so much higher. It's well known that these are, I don't know if socialist is the right term, but a much larger social safety net in general. And the U.S. has been slowly pushing towards more and more social services for decades now, while they've been pushing back against those tax increases. Brent talks about tax the rich, but it doesn't do anything. They're already paying the vast majority of the tax base. You have to, if you want to take that 20 to the next level, you have to be taxing everyone else, poor people in the middle class, materially more.
I think David Sachs and Friedberg were played with the point, and that you're not going to get government revenue to GDP above 20%. And I was wondering, is that just like a psychological thing? Is that like an economic law that you just can't extract anymore because there's like this concept of like the Laffer curve and all that stuff where you start increasing taxes and it pushes down economic activity. People make different decisions to avoid the taxes. Capital leaves the country, whatever it is, you just can't get it above. Just because raising taxes does not equate to a rise in government revenue. So I was wondering, is like 20%, is that the number? The answer was like, no, and the people who are
20 seems to be the number, like in the context of these other countries taking in twice as much. If those other countries were also at 20%, I bet that this number, we'd see 10 or 15 or something.
What do you mean?
The idea that if you raise taxes doesn't necessarily raise government receipts is that people are going to leave the country, capital is going to leave the country. But if they've got, it's all relative to other countries. So it's going to leave the country, but where's it going to go, right? In Europe, you're getting charged 40%, so you're not going to go there. So you come to the US instead because you're about half.
Okay.
Whereas if your only options were other countries that were already paying 60, we might see this as something different, because then I would imagine the US could see that, all right, we can raise this because there's nowhere else to go.
So do you think they can raise it? Is that what you're saying? I mean, it's like, okay,
yes.
You think so?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking about the overall level, we're not talking about this tax the rich stuff, right? We're talking about the entire population.
Anything. Basically,
yeah.
Okay, so
you could very easily do that.
So like, look, so here's the next graph, right? This is the next thing I want to look at. This is the receipts thing that we were looking at, and this huge jump over here. And then these are outlays, right? So to walk you through this, this is, obviously this is the war spending. This is COVID spending. This is the 2008 financial crisis spending. Over here, this is the 90s surplus. But like what people are advocating, if you want to try to solve this problem, this debt problem, you could either bring this orange number down, right? Or I guess what people are trying to argue is like, you got to bring this blue line up. You got to pull another 1942 Revenue Act through Congress that like completely changes and broadens the tax base, raises taxes for everyone, and wham, get it up to like 30, 40, Northern European levels. Is that what they're advocating? That none of this like little dilly-dallying or whatever that happened throughout, the 60s, 70s, 80s, where you're kind of like tweaking the code a little bit and saying, hey, we earned all this money over the next 10 years. It's not going to move the needle. No, you got to be like, okay, everyone raising your taxes by like 10% across the board.
Middle class. And that's
the middle class. The middle class is going to do it. That's really what they're talking about.
Like all classes. That's the point.
Yeah. Anyway, so, that kind of brought in. Anyway, I mean, I still maintain, I'm going to be a little stubborn here, that I think it's a spending problem fundamentally, because, even at these other countries, I mean, I think France was the highest thing on that list. They're still running a deficit. It's like, government, it feels like government is going to deficit. It's just kind of what they do. They're going to push it as far as they can because money and credit. By the way, I'm reading Dalio's book right now on, big debt cycles. Okay.
What he's saying. Surprise.
Yeah. And what he's saying makes a lot of sense to me. Governments, it just feels good to push money and credit into the system. It just feels good. And they're just going to push it as hard as they can. And I guess at some point you just kind of got to draw a line. So like to solve the debt, just do what you got to do. Lower spending, I hesitate to raise taxes. The other thing actually that I wanted to mention here is that, and I think this also jumps out, is the fact that they introduced the Revenue Act in 1942 to pay for the war. But guess what, Joe? The taxes didn't decline after the war. They kept all those taxes. They don't go down. They go up. They might go down, a little bit, but they kept them. Even after the war was paid for, they kept them. All right, let's kind of, after going through that little journey together, Joe, let's revisit some of these comments. So how did the debt spiral work after the Second World War? I think part of it was, taxes, inflation, and growth. Exponentially raise taxes. Exponentially, I might debate with, but I think broadly this
a little bit of hyperbole,
right.
But yeah.
This one, we cannot raise taxes enough to cover the deficit spending. I would have agreed with this before I sort of dove into this. And it's like, maybe you could. It's not impossible. But I think politically and all that, it's like impossible. But just from strictly like it's not like
it's definitely possible.
Yeah, this person is advocating for sounds like more taxes. Which again, I'm naturally against. I think taxes are high enough. But I would push back. It's like, I think we're just going to run deficit. It doesn't matter how much you tax, personally. And evidence
also makes sense, though, right? In the Dalio sense, he ties it to the cycle of money itself. Whenever you're on the gold standard linked to a physical asset, you can't push it that far. Yep. That goes away gradually. And then money is this resource for the government to spend. You always want to push it as far as you can.
Yeah.
And you don't have any limit anymore. So
yep,
it's just kind of natural.
Yeah. Again, reading it right now, very interesting, definitely worthwhile to dive into. And I think he talks about the monetary policy regimes, and he lined it up with the US, and we're currently sort of in the last one. Very interesting.
I'll read it too, and we can
I'll organize.
Yeah, on it.
I'll organize my thoughts a little more. It's definitely worth like a close read and a study, and getting graphics and stuff like that. Very interesting. It's sort of interesting to see just where the debt is. So it starts in the private sector, and then it moves. So it moved in 2008, or after 2008, from the private sector to the public sector, so the government. And then the next stage is after it moves from the public sector to the central bank. And once the central bank starts, getting into kind of trouble itself, that's kind of the end. The central banks go to the last place where this debt can be. And right now the central bank is not looking too great. Just for strictly anyway. All right, Joe. What is the next thing that you want to talk about?
How about discretionary mandatory spending?
Oh, wrong. Sorry, Joe. What you really want to talk about is DOGE and codifying the savings. But not too bad. You're 1 for 2, which is
pretty
honestly
close.
Way better than I thought you would be. I was banking on the fact that you wouldn't get the first one. It's going to be really easy for both of us. I got 2 clips for you. They're both kind of long, and I did a little bit of editing for them because the point is kind of bouncing around. So let's play the first one.
Give me somebody in DOGE that I can work with, so that as soon as you identify the spending, we can connect it to an appropriation account. We can connect it to a mandatory spending account, so we can actually codify it. He doesn't seem to have the time, and quite honestly, in a personal conversation, he said, well, we don't have to do that. Well, we do have to do that. The fact of the matter is, it has to be codified. Just putting on a website is valuable, but we got to bank the savings. And so anything that's mandatory has got to be done through reconciliation. Otherwise, it's got to be done from rescission. The question is whether the president on his own can impound those funds. So they may not be spent, but they're just going to be, sitting out there as, unallocated spending to be spent sometime in the future, unless you rescind them. And again, that's the beauty of rescission and reconciliation. We don't need Democrats to help us there. We can do that with simple majorities of both the House and the Senate.
So you saw that. I mean, also the little gaffe there by the editors at All In or whatever, where Chamath was like muted or whatever. That wasn't me. Okay. That was it. They also actually had another little mistake that I was tempted to play with. I thought that was that was worse when they just cut off Ron Johnson mid-sentence. So rescission. The point here is the rescission thing. And I was looking and I was like, geez, this sounded really familiar. Didn't we, Joe, you know what I'm talking about here, Joe? Joe, you know what I'm talking about? I want to play you another clip. Okay. But you might want to like look away real quick, because just the sheer brilliance, might hurt your eyes of what you're about to watch.
You'd hear like you would see kind of posted around. Part of the discussion has to do with the idea of the president impounding funds. So what that means, I guess, back in the Nixon era, he disagreed with some of the spending that Congress was appropriating, and he just didn't spend it. He impounded the funds, and Congress didn't really appreciate that too much. So they passed another bill called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. That sort of limited the president's ability to do that. And this is something that has been popped up a lot in the X debates, guess more broadly, the debates, saying that the president has to spend this money. It's like illegal. He can't just not spend it. And that didn't like totally ring true to me. It just seems kind of crazy to say that, like in the Lutheran example and the children coming over, what if there wasn't 100,000 kids? What if there were like no kids? What are they going to spend it on? Do they have to spend it? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And there's actually something that the president can do. And there are two things. There's a rescission and there's a deferral, I guess, that the president can do. And rescission, so deferral, you push it off. Rescission just means you ask Congress to get rid of it. What he could do is just write a special message back to Congress that specifies the following bits of information and essentially asks Congress to cancel out this spending. He says, you basically just got to tell Congress how much, which departments, the reason. The president has to write the maximum extent practicable, the estimated fiscal, economic, and budgetary effect. Then you put forward, write them the facts. So that's kind of the work that DOGE is doing right now. Then Congress has 45 days to pass a bill that if they agree with it, will rescind the funds. And I don't know, man. That seems like a good game plan. I would be totally on board with that. I mean, if DOGE just went department by department and did that, and like every month or 2 months or something, Congress was getting like one of these special messages. You don't need to write a bill to cut programs. Okay.
Yeah.
I got to say, I think that still rings true. Trump has the executive office. The Republicans have the Congress. I mean, this is the time. And I think that's why Johnson was so frustrated. I mean, he said that now is the time and we don't need Democrats' help. Even the thumbnail in the All In basically just said, this is our one chance and we're blowing it. And this kind of leads us right into sort of the recent news with that big, beautiful bill and the big fallout and, and just the ramp up in government spending and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really quite disappointing. You just mentioned, or I guess the thumbnail said, this is our one chance. At least to me, this public falling out that's happening today is kind of like nail in the coffin. It's like, we blew it. This is it. This is our like the tax bill is not materially reducing the deficit. I think there is an argument to be made that it's better than previous ones, but we're like splitting hairs at that point. It's clear now there's going to be no material difference. Unfortunately, I don't know why this is, but the impact of DOGE is at least an order of magnitude lower than Elon thought it would be, or most people hoped it would be. It's effectively not moving the needle either. So we kind of haven't changed anything. And this is our one shot, at least for the next few years, it seems. And there's no improvement. There's no material improvement. Like nothing's going, like back to your initial chart on income or government receipts to GDP, maybe that bumps around very slightly, but it's not going to, that orange line is still going to be so far away from it. Like the public falling out, just, as we're recording here, happened just a few hours ago. It's been really ugly. Not even just that. The takeaways that we were just talking about, we are blowing it. It was just done. It's just it ended with a bang, just a really ugly bang. It's tough to see now where things are going to go once this painful deleveraging is finally forced upon us, whether that's through inflation, economic decline, whatever it is. We're eventually going to be forced into something. We've blown our shot in 2025 to move the needle in the other direction. And if we could have at least changed the direction a little bit in kind of a fundamental way, Elon left last week and said, oh, DOGE it's a way of thinking in government. It's, don't be sad I'm leaving. It's just all rang completely hollow to me, even before this huge falling out. And now after that, it's a total joke. It means nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's another thing that Johnson said that was kind of on the list of footnotes that we couldn't get to. So there were 7 that I listed, kind of that I had jotted down when I was listening. We only really had time for 2 of them. The last one, though, was the willful ignorance, and people don't know and don't really care about the debt. And that was one of the things that Ron Johnson said when he was talking to other senators. I mean, these are, congresspersons. They don't want to talk. They don't care. They don't think it's a big deal. And that says a lot. I mean, that says worlds. They write it off to, use a bad pun.
Yeah, I wonder if what's the motivation there? Is it purely just the pursuit of power? My chances of staying in power are going to increase if I'm more liberal with my spending and, not.
He said it, right?
My constituents.
Yeah, I mean, he said it. It's just like one of the, show me the member of Congress that ever lost an election because they spent too much money.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I guess what I was going to say after, it's like, or is it even worse? And it's like, some of these individuals don't even fully understand. And I say that because if you watch some of these congressional testimonies on very specific topics, there's experts in front of them and they get asked very in-depth, very technical questions by a lot of members of Congress. But then there's a non-trivial number that just, by the questions, that they're just completely out of their element. And I'm not sure if they choose to do that, or I think some of them just don't even get it.
Yeah, no, actually you're 100% right. I remember, that's a very good point. I've listened to these, people asking. I remember a long time ago when I kind of started my whole Econ career, when Ben Bernanke was still getting asked questions. And I remember listening to the questions and I'm just like, they have no idea what they're talking about. And I was just like an intro Econ student or something.
There was one just recently with Besson. It's one of the Democratic, members of Congress. They open by saying, extremely political, saying you're giving Elon and DOGE completely unfettered access to everything. And Besson, right away gave a very level-headed, objective explanation of what they do and do not have access to. But then thereafter, the member of Congress just said the same exact thing 4 or 5 more times, just trying to push him into a political gotcha moment. It didn't work at all, but it was embarrassing to watch.
So,
because it was so clear what they were trying to do.
Yes. I guess you kind of hope that if they have cameras on them, that they sort of act differently, that they're not really like that. It's just political theater. They strategize about, how to make the other side look as bad as possible.
Yeah.
And they kind of ask along those lines and this is the tact and we're going to stick to it. This is a strategy. But you kind of think that behind closed doors, when they're really negotiating this stuff, that there are adults in the room. They're actually not trying to just take jabs at them. But you wonder, because there's a huge information gap here. I don't know what conversations are like behind closed doors. You hope that there are, but maybe they just aren't. Maybe it's just like this all the way down. All right, so thanks for tuning in to the Root of All Evil podcast. I'm Luke.
And I'm Joe.
We'll see you next week.
See you then.
Bye.